I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the agreement that allowed the Americans to use Diego Garcia and led to the expulsion of the Chagossians.
1960s agreement between Harold Wilson and Lyndon Johnson was quite complicated because it was the Americans were heavily into Vietnam. Britain was under enormous pressure to join the Vietnam War. Whilst Wilson did give political support to the US operations in Vietnam, he never sent troops there. He was under pressure to do so. He also was negotiating the independence of Mauritius at the same time, and Mauritius independence always had a claim on the Chagos Islands archipelago and Diego Garcia to be part of Mauritius. The independence came without them being part of Mauritius. At the same time, Britain agreed a lease arrangement with the US in which they would get the use of Diego Garcia until 2016, which they could use as a jumping off point for the Vietnam War, or indeed any other conflict, as we've subsequently discovered. And Britain took delivery of some Polaris submarines at the same time for carrying their nuclear missiles. It did not become US territory, it remains British territory, and the lease is up in 2016 and has to be renewed or renegotiated at that point. It's quite confusing who actually claimed that the archipelago had to be depopulated to make way for the base on Diego Garcia, because there's a very big distance between the two. But nevertheless, the islands were depopulated deliberately by the British acting on behalf of the Americans, where they were either physically taken off the island or driven off the island or removed by deception. In some cases, people had gone for medical treatment to Port Louis, for example, and were not allowed to return. And finally, they were all removed, and it was opposed in the British Parliament principally by Robin Cook, a newly elected MP in 1970 when the removal started to take place. And there's a kind of synergy about that, because Robin Cook on the result of the High Court action by Chagossians in 2000, when they sought the right of return, and they won their case in the High Court, he refused to allow a Foreign Office appeal against him. He was, of course, Foreign Secretary at the time.
The history of the Chagossian people since then has been very long and complex, but I wonder if there's a particular piece of it you find particularly powerful or particularly distasteful from a UK point of view.
What I find distasteful is the lies and deception that surrounded the removal, the limited amount of compensation they were given, the way they were forced into a marginalised existence, mainly in Mauritius, some in the Seychelles. And what I find remarkable is the way they've stayed together as a community. Because it would have been very easy just to give up and try and escape, go somewhere else, whatever. They didn't. They stayed together as a community in Mauritius and gradually gained a lot of support and political recognition in Mauritius, and now quite significant political community in Mauritius. The significance of their campaign as a long one is very important. The chicanery of the Foreign Office in trying to divide the Diego Garcia and Chagos people from each other has been legendary. But the court case in 2000 was a turning point, as was the decision by Jack Straw to put two orders in council through in 2004, the Constitutional Order and the Immigration Order, which effectively prevented the right of return. In a sense, in a very real sense, they negated the High Court decision, but being an order in council and not debatable in Parliament. I did raise them, of course, in debate, but nevertheless they could not be constitutionally challenged in Parliament because they are the Crown's ability to bypass the House of Commons. We've been through seemingly years of court cases, including the application to the European Court of Human Rights, which eventually was unsuccessful in the sense they said they didn't have jurisdiction. The Foreign Office finally did agree on a new feasibility study, which they appointed consultants to undertake, and this was done during William Hague's time as Foreign Secretary. He agreed it, and also agreed a timetable by which the study would be completed by December 2014, would be reported to the Foreign Office and reported to Parliament early in 2015, and a statement and a debate would take place in Parliament before the dissolution of Parliament, which is due on the 30th of March. I've raised the matter with William Hague, who's now leader of the House of Commons, and have been told in terms that it will be done, it will happen, and there will be a debate about it. We, as the Chagos Islands group in the House of Commons, which I'm chair of, the all-party Chagos group, did give evidence to this this operation and had quite a long and interesting meeting with the consultants on it. Obviously, it's difficult to know how many Chagossians would want to return. I think the crucial issue is the right of return. And if they did return, then clearly there has to be some infrastructure developments. And I guess it would be limited fishing whilst preserving the marine protection area principle. And ecotourism would be the source of income for it. But I just think the principle of the right to go back is a very important one.
The implications of the feasibility study for resettlement?
I'm expecting it to say that resettlement is possible. They will raise questions about the height of some of the islands above sea level. They will raise questions about the kind of infrastructure that's necessary there, whether there should be a landing strip of any sort, whether there should be some kind of small port facility. All those kind of questions are going to be raised there. And obviously they have to be discussed and have to be debated. But the principle is, one, the right of return, two, support for the principle of a protection zone, a marine protection zone around the islands, which would preserve the ecosystem and the fish, and sustainable fishing only by the islanders. I think it can work. I also think that the islanders themselves would be much better custodians of the islands and the archipelago than a British ship that trawls around the place and occasionally goes there. There are people who visit the islands now, and they are sort of world touring yachts people who have enough money to be able to sail around the world in quite substantial yachts and are allowed to camp and stay there. And with apparent approval by the British administration, whilst the Chagos Islanders themselves are absolutely not allowed to go there except on supervised visits by the Foreign Office, which I find it double standards, I think, are the word I'm looking for.
I think that's about right, isn't it?
Well, there could even be a stronger word.
So why do you think successive governments have been so reluctant and directly opposed to resolving this issue?
There's a deep embarrassment in the Foreign Office about the lies and hypocrisy that surrounded this issue. The way in which the islanders were never told, there was just action taken to remove them. The secrecy surrounding the Wilson-Johnson talks, the secrecy surrounding what the base actually does, and of course the ultimate secrecy of the way that Diego Garcia has been used for extraordinary rendition by the Americans, and the British must have known about it. It is not possible that a British commissioner, and there is one, or a British police presence, based at the US facility in Diego Garcia, did not know this was going on. If they didn't know, they should have known. If they did know, they should have said, because it was claimed by the US that Britain was not used for extraordinary rendition. There are also questions about the use of Prestwick Airport, but that's perhaps a slightly different issue. There's that. There's also a view that they have to defend the mistakes of the Foreign Office in the past, and this was clearly a massive mistake, and they seem to be continuously embarrassed when the issue is raised. In our all-party parliamentary group, it's a very unusual group. It includes people of a very wide variety of political views. I mean, I'm the chair of it. Andrew Rosendale is a Conservative MP, is the vice chair. Other members include Richard Luce, Lord Luce, who was the Foreign Office Minister in the early 1980s. It includes John Prescott, who was, of course, a Cabinet Minister. Janet Whittaker, Lady Baroness Whittaker in the House of Lords, and a whole variety of other members. And Henry Smith, of course, MP for Crawley, where there is a Chagossian population. So that group, which includes Lord David Steele as well, brings together quite an interesting range of opinion and knowledge on the issue. And our unpaid voluntary coordinator is David Snoxall, who was was a British High Commissioner in Mauritius. Indeed, I first met him in Mauritius when I went to visit the Chagos Islanders, and he, of course, has enormous knowledge about the place and the subject, and so it's quite formidable. And when we went to see William Hague, he said to our delegation very kindly, he said, "You should do all the talking. You know far more about it than I do." I have hardly any Chagossian constituents. I got involved because it's a simple matter of justice. And I had a letter from Olivier Bancourt many years ago asking me to take up the case. And then when the British Overseas Territories Bill was put before Parliament, I was appointed to the standing committee of that bill, and together with Tam Dalyell moved an amendment which was to grant British nationality to the Chagos Islanders, both current and by descent. In other words, the immediate descendants of those that were removed from the islands. I was told by the Foreign Office that my amendment was technically deficient, and the Foreign Office called me and said they were going to put up an alternate amendment which met my demands. And I went to talk to the Foreign Office about it. It was not a perfect replica of what I wanted, because there is still a bit of a loophole, which is a bit of a problem for a small number of Chagossians, but it is a problem. I then withdrew my amendment in favour of theirs, and it was agreed by the committee. And Tam Dalyell and I felt quite pleased that we at least made some progress now, because that forces the British government then to take seriously the whole question of the right of British citizens to return to what is British colonial territory. What happens in the future is going to be very interesting, because Mauritius has a claim on the islands. It was always part of the negotiations that at some point Mauritius would take over the sovereignty of them. That's some distance off. I don't know what's going to happen there. Our purpose as a group is to guarantee the right of return of the islanders. That's our purpose.
Very serious allegations now around the use of Diego Garcia in extraordinary rendition. That, combined with the history of UK in treating the Chagossian so appallingly, do you think that seriously damages the UK's ability to act as an advocate of human rights or speak on any old global issues?
Well, the war on terror, which Britain happily went along with, has been the most gross denial of human rights of people, with Bagram Air Base, with Abu Ghraib, with Guantanamo Bay, with extraordinary rendition, and we're still fighting now for Shakarami to come home from Guantanamo Bay, and Britain's complicity in that damages the ability of any UK government to speak with any clear voice on human rights abuses anywhere in the world. If you want to speak out against human rights abuses, make sure you're not complicit in them yourself. And we clearly are. If Diego Garcia has been used, and I believe it has, for extraordinary rendition, likewise airports in Britain.
So you mentioned the that it's been somewhat unrepresented in successive governments as an issue, but why do you think it's been also quite underrepresented in the media? Just as we don't seem to get a lot of attention, even though some of it is.
Well, it occasionally gets some publicity. I mean, the Pilger film that
Mm.
time got quite a lot of publicity, and that was a help. It's a small number of people. The numbers in Britain are very small. There seem to be essentially two communities, one in Manchester and one in Crawley. Not so many in London. So there isn't a big community. There's never going to be a big community. It's a very small number of people altogether. But it does have a resonance. I remember going to the World Social Forum in Mumbai in 2004. And at the opening rally, 100,000 people there, I decided to talk about the Chagossians. Because I saw a group of Chagossians. I knew they were going to be there, and they were there as well. So I spoke about it, not the whole of my speech, but some of it, just making the point that colonial powers have lots of dirty linen, and that dirty linen occasionally needs to be washed in public, and this is one of them. This is one of these garments that needs a good clean.
Speak of, I know you've worked closely with various Chagossian groups in the past. How do you feel speaking with them? It's a very unique position, as you say, they've essentially been fighting against very powerful governments from a position of very little power for decades.
I admire them, and when I've been in the Foreign Office with Olivier Bancourt and others on delegations, it's been interesting. You just think, yeah, we're in the Foreign Office, this building, where Palmerston, Gladstone, Disraeli, all of them have been there. All of them have organised some terrible things from that place. And it is a place that once thought it ruled the whole world and is now a Foreign Office of a different era. I thought, yeah, there's a kind of poetic justice going on here. But more significantly, when we went to the High Court, I went to most of the High Court hearings, having the Chagos Islanders having their day in court, sitting there and being represented by people like Sir Sidney Kentridge, really impressive. You think, yeah, at last the British establishment, for all its arrogance, is now having to face up to these islanders who they thought were expendable and they could get rid of. The racist comments that were made, the Man Friday comments, all that kind of thing. All this stuff eventually comes home to roost. Another parallel of a slightly different age was sitting in the same High Court, actually the same room, it was interesting, with the people from Kenya who were so grossly treated by the British Army in the 1950s, who were seeking compensation. At the end, you get justice, but you only get justice if you stick at it, and I've got full of admiration for the Chagos Islanders.
Is there anything in particular you and the all-party group would like to see in the final report?
The first one, as I've said, is the principle of the right of return. The second is a sustainable economy when they're there, which would be a combination, possibly some small-scale agriculture, certainly ecotourism, and certainly a degree of regulated fishing that ensures there is no damage done to the reefs and there is sustainable fish stocks there. That is possible to achieve with proper monitoring. It's actually far more likely to happen than the current danger, where there is a great deal of danger of a lot of illegal fishing going on because of the limited control over the waters around the archipelago.
Yeah.
There is also a question of the environmental damage and pollution that's happened from Diego Garcia itself, from the base, with reports of chemical and oil spillage. I've raised these matters in debates in the House as to what actually happens there. And when the Environment Audit Committee did a report on overseas territories, I used that as an opportunity to raise the issue of the Chagos Islands. And so we want to see proper respect for the environment. What happens in debate with the US, whether the base will be renewed or not, I don't know. I'm the last person in the world to want an American base anywhere. If there is one, there is one. If there isn't one, then it's gone. But there's no reason not to allow return to the other parts of Diego Garcia, because the base does not take up the whole of the island. In every other place in the world where there is any kind of military base, people live near it.
Yeah.
People live near bases in the UK.
Yeah.
You know, in Brize Norton, in Lakenheath, all those places. People live near it, even Fast Lane. So why not?
And I know the lease of the base actually expires in 2016.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it would be a disgrace surely if that was extended, but Chagosian resettlement was denied.
Well, it would be absolutely shocking, and one of our tactics has been to raise the issue of the American political establishment as well, and we have obviously carried on with doing that, and we keep on raising it wherever we can, and Richard Luce in particular has a lot of contacts in the USA and keeps raising the issue there. We're a group of people that are incredibly diverse politically, but we unite around the specific issue of the right of return.
On the Americans, do you think they would have serious objections to living with a resettled Chagosian population?
No, I don't. I think we've been led a line by the Foreign Office for years that it's the Americans that are opposed to resettlement. All the indications we've had are that they are not concerned about resettlement of the archipelago and are even prepared to consider resettlement of parts of Diego Garcia itself. There is a very big gap between the two anyway. And so I think it's very much a British Foreign Office decision that we have to get changed.
One of the lines we often hear in the Foreign Office say, certainly in the recent past, is that Chagosians have already received substantial or generous compensation in the past, and obviously that's something that Chagosians dispute a little or a lot. I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
If you take away somebody's place of living, right to live, and lifestyle and existence, you can't just buy it out of them. And they feel very angry and very aggrieved. They're a fishing people and a fishing community, and so being dragged away from their islands and told they've got to go and live in Mauritius. Many that were paid actually quite limited amounts of compensation had it stolen from them by land agents and all kinds of chicanery that went on. They're not a wealthy community, they're actually very poor. I've visited many of them. They're living in a very poor situation in Mauritius, and I think we owe it to them, we owe it to justice. Put it another way, there are a small number of British overseas territories around the world: Gibraltar, St Helena, Pitcairn Island, Falkland Islands, British Indian Ocean territories. There is apparently an unlimited budget for military expenditure and other expenditure in the Falkland Islands. There is no such budget for the British Indian Ocean territories, except the legal bills of fighting the very just claims of the Chagossian people. I'm on the side of the Chagossian people.